merci beaucoup. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici. C'est un environnement très intéressant. Pour moi, c'est bien école. J'ai juste faire un petit tour. Et je suis aujourd'hui ici à Paris en traverse de Strasbourg pour la prochaine session plénière là. Je voudrais parler en anglais si c'est pas possible pour vous parce que comme j'ai parlé des termes techniques et de la protection des données, c'est un peu difficile encore pour moi de faire ça en français. Bien que je suis français parce que ma grand-mère est française aussi, mais mon français c'est un peu ouais, bas. Alors, je vais expliquer en anglais, mais c'est possible de poser des questions ou de juste appeler à moi de expliquer quelque chose que c'était pas clair aussi en français, si vous voulez. Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Philipp Albrecht. I'm now 34 years old, and when I entered the European Parliament in 2009, I was 26. I come from northern Germany, around Hanover. And when I was in school, like between age of 13 and 15, I was doing more or less only programming, coding, and I did like 3D design with software which I ordered by sending $200 to Malaysia, hoping that some CDs come back, and they came back. And we had a program called 3D Studio. I don't know if that exists still, which back then was costing around like 15,000 euros or something, and we were doing stuff with it. And I planned to study informatics, but then I got into I got drawn into the school journal of my school, and I was starting writing normal articles with text, and I was starting to be interested in politics, and then I decided to become a journalist. And then when I was a journalist, somebody told me that if you want to be a journalist, you have to study law. So I studied law, and then while studying law, I thought, oh, that's very interesting. I like that very much. I want to become a lawyer. And then I was again political activist in parallel all the time. And then somebody asked me, do you want to become a politician? And I said, yeah, maybe, but only if I can get into the European Parliament, because all the digital stuff I'm interested in is decided there, which was completely unrealistic at that moment. But then like 1 or 2 years later, I was in the European Parliament, elected, as I said, and so I became a politician. So that's my story. And in the European Parliament, I'm now 8 years as a member of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee. I'm even vice chair there now. It's one of the most important committees in the European Parliament today. It hasn't been before, but things have changed with the Lisbon Treaty and many, many decisions of the European Union in that area of civil liberties, fundamental rights, and especially in the area of digital society, digital economy, digital rights, because more and more people understood that the internet has no borders, and that it's very difficult to regulate anything in the internet in a state which is limited in its borders. But also, of course, we all knew that it's a long way to agree on the same standards with quite a lot of countries around the world, because they are not really democracies, they are not really based on our values. So at least on a European level, we try to get together and set some standards, and that is actually what we are doing quite a lot in the European Union now. And one of the biggest examples and one of the most important steps in this direction is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a very complicated name, and of course also a complicated dossier, perhaps not for you, but for many people out there. Personal data, data protection. And I would like to explain mainly why this step is so important, and then perhaps elaborate a little bit on what is actually regulated there, before we then also can perhaps talk about other issues. And I would like to also invite you for questions, because I guess that maybe there are more questions focused on certain issues rather that you would like to hear me talking all the time. So why is the General Data Protection Regulation and this new EU approach to data protection so important? The first issue is that the General Data Protection Regulation will be the global standard for data protection. We have voted an EU regulation, but we will very soon see, already before the 25th of May next year, when this will be starting to be an effective law, that many companies around the globe will apply these standards for their global business, and that many states in the world will try to adopt similar or even the same rules. And secondly, this is an important file because for the first time in history, the European Union decided on a very important, substantial issue of our lives in a way of a regulation. Because mainly, to elaborate a little bit on that, mainly the European Union acts in the form of directives, which means that the Parliament of the European Union and the Council of Ministers of the European Union, they together decide on certain principles to be done in that or this area, but then the concrete rules, the laws, are made still by the member states. The French government then has to draft a law which then takes into account the provisions of the EU, but it's still a national implementation necessary. With an EU regulation, that will be different. And that's why regulations in the European Union until today are mostly used for technical applications, like the specificalities of such a bottle on the European market, you know, that it has to be safe and so on, that there are no additions in which can poison me or something. So things which nobody cares about, you know. So, but now, especially with this regulation, the European Union gets into our lives with very emotional issues, which entail bigger importance of regulation. And a regulation means that the EU regulates something, and afterwards it has to be applied in exactly that manner, and there's no change anymore by the national government, and the law will stand above national law. So the General Data Protection Regulation will be part of the French legal system. There's no French legal act anymore necessary to do that. From the 25th of May, this will be the law which governs personal data, not only in France, but in all 28 different member states of the European Union, at least until one of them leaves. Nobody knows if that's really happening. Anyway, so this is the change which a regulation will bring, and that makes, of course, a huge difference, because there's much more common European approach by that. And these two issues, that there is the global standard set by the European Union on data protection, and that the European Union walks ahead together with the regulation, it's showing a little bit, or it's hinting a little bit on the big changes which this reform brings. Because what we do as Europeans is that we say, it's not anymore necessary to understand like which member state I am in, and to say, okay, if Facebook sets his or her its seat in the European Union in Dublin, in Ireland, then there's Irish law applicable to us. Or if Amazon goes to Luxembourg, it's Luxembourgish law, and nobody really understands that. We just say, or if it's a company sitting in Russia and they do something, then maybe it's only Russian law applicable. But we said that this has to end. That's too much fragmentation, and it's completely worthless in many cases, because most of our apps, most of the services we use, they are not even situated in the European Union. Data is flowing across the board everywhere in Europe, but also outside of the European Union. So the answer to it was to say, when we really want to have our values respected, that in the European Union, data protection and privacy are fundamental rights, and we want them to be respected by companies and state authorities, then we have to say that for the European market, everyone who comes here and sells products or services have to respect the same rules. And that is the so-called market location principle. So that we say to the world, wherever you come from, if you sit in Ireland, if you sit in France or on the Bahamas or in the United States, doesn't matter. If you do services or sell products here in the European Union, you have to adhere to the same standards, to the same rules. And they are written in this regulation. And if you don't behave, if you don't comply with these standards, wherever you sit, you will be sanctioned. You will be sanctioned with up to 4% of your yearly worldwide turnout when it is about an enterprise, a company. And that decision, which the European Union took throughout the last years, that shows that we just want to say seriously, respect our rules. If you want to play in our backyards, you have to do it alongside of our rules. And the effect of it, as I indicated, is that today, already before this regulation comes into force, most of the companies worldwide already decided to say, okay, as the European Union is the first region in the world which regulates it so specifically and so clearly, and as the European market is the biggest common market in the world, and as it technically makes no sense for a company like Google to say we do a European Google and another Google and so on, we just decide to implement the standards on a global basis. And thereby, in the end, we didn't only safeguard that the rights of the 500 million Europeans in Europe are equally protected, but we, in the end, achieved to set a global high standard on data protection without negotiating with any of the other countries. Of course, that's quite a bold step, but I think that it is, in a way, the only way of creating global standards alongside our own values at the moment. Maybe in the future that will be different, and we will be able to also decide on common common international standards across Europe, America, Asia. But for the moment, at least with a certain level of democracy, that's not really possible. So we have to set our own standards and say to the world that this is where we stand, without closing down, without saying the internet, we ignore it, we build the European internet, but with saying we accept the open internet, but we also say there is a market, and that is the European consumers, and they can expect that they get these rights enforced. That's the basic idea of this approach, and you can see that we followed a little bit the idea of competition and antitrust rules by setting this market location principle, by setting high sanctions to it, and with this we now bring data protection really to something which counts rather than which is only there on paper, because until today data protection as a rule was very much ignored by many companies, by many actors, and there was no real harm in ignoring it. And we had the impression that it is necessary for a digital society, for a digital economy, to have some basic standards and rules applied. This is not new, what we in substance decided. So data protection didn't really substantially, or will not really substantially, change with the GDPR. It has been more or less the same since 35 years in Europe. There are some certain basic principles which you can basically read in the Fundamental Rights Charter of the European Union. So that's also why we can't change it as Europeans, because it's written into our treaties. We would have to have all the governments to agree to change that, so that won't happen very soon. And you will find in Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights that everyone has the right to the protection of personal data, meaning that in Europe it's not only a fundamental right, it's a human right. Everybody. You don't need a citizenship for that. You don't need to I don't know, constantly live in the European Union, as long as you are here, you are protected under that law. And protecting personal data in Europe means that you can use personal data only on two ways. Either on the informed consent of a person or on the basis of a law. So a law needs to say to you, you can process personal data for this or that purpose. And that is already following to that. It can only be done for a specific purpose, and it needs to be limited to that specific purpose. And the individual whose personal data are processed has the right to access that personal data, to correct it, or even to erase it if it's not necessary anymore, and to get relevant information about what's happening. All that's written in our constitution. And that is what is describing the fundamental right on personal data. And then in addition, it's also written there that there needs to be an independent authority who oversees that. In France, it's the CNIL. And that's everywhere in the European Union. So basically that exists already quite a time now. The Fundamental Rights Charter was drafted in the year 2000. And the principles which are in there, they exist already since the 80s latest. So in 1980, we had a convention of the Council of Europe, which sits in Strasbourg and entails 47 countries, including all the EU countries, where there was a convention on personal data protection, which is called Convention 108, and that is setting a high standard for data protection in Europe quite a time already. So in substance, there's nothing really new. But there are some things which we have written into this new regulation, which I think will a little bit improve the idea of data protection. Because, first of all, perhaps we need to understand that data protection perhaps is not really the right term to address this point, because many people think it's about protecting data. But in the end, it's it's not really about protecting data, but it's about protecting humans. So it could have been named also human protection. I need to open it. It needs to be regulated. But if we would call it human protection, of course, it would be even more meaningless than data protection. But at the end, it's about the human involved. It's not the data. And there's a big decision which is made in data protection, and that is the distinction between personal data and all the other data. Because data protection only deals with personal data, with data with which I can identify you. If I say that this thingy here is made out of wood, then this is an information which is not at all personal. Different than if I would say that in this room there is a person looking this and that, and that's only one person, and then I can maybe, at least we all in the room, can identify that person. Then it becomes maybe personal data. So there's this kind of gray zone between what is necessary to identify a person and where does it start, where does it end. That's always still in the debate and in interpretation. But in general, the distinction is between information which I can't use to identify one single person and data which I can use to identify or single out one person. And only where this is the case, the latter, that I can identify a person, only there data protection laws apply. So if I process anonymous data about whatever, about big numbers of persons which I can't identify individually, then I don't need to follow data protection laws. That's also important to understand, because when people develop new products, for example, the principle of data minimization only applies to personal data. I cannot of course use massive loads of information as long as it's not personal. There are persons out there who say that in the future there's no information which is not personal. I think that's complete rubbish, because you can anonymize information and you can process information which is not personal. So there is at least this differentiation, and only where there is the possibility to identify a person, I need to respect data protection laws. And there we said, if you do that, and that is the new principle which we brought in, you should follow the principles of privacy by design and by default. That's basically to make sure that data is only processed for the purpose which it should be processed for, and that data and that there is not more personal data processed than it is needed to fulfill that purpose. So purpose limitation and data limitation, or data minimization. And these principles, they are guiding the whole idea of data protection, and they are now also specifically regulated by the provisions on privacy by design and by default, that there should be all the products, all the services developed in a way that you respect the principles of data protection when you develop that. And that you say, if the user starts to use a service or product, then the settings of that product or service should be in a privacy-friendly manner, and I can change it in the opposite way to process more personal data if I would like to. Another step forward, which we develop now with the new regulation, is that there's a far more specific provision on consent, that the mere use of a service is not consent. It's not free and informed consent, but free and informed consent and active consent is only if I do something, only if I actively say, yes, I want my data to be processed, or something I have to actively do. Because if I only use the service, or there is a pre-crossed box or something and I have to change something, then I could just go ahead without doing anything and my data will be processed. So that was very important to change that and to make that clear. There is always an action needed. The second big change is that there needs to be more information on what is happening with my personal data. For example, when there's algorithmic processing, that the logic behind the processing of personal data need to be made transparent for the individual. So when I do, for example, scoring about a certain person in order to assess if you're willing to pay your bills or something with your personal data, I do scoring, then I need to explain somehow what is the kind of analytics which I use to your data, so that you can understand why that processing comes to a certain result. That's only one example of the additional information rights which will be brought in with this general data protection regulation. But there's also provisions, for example, on data protection terms, because most of them are written by lawyers, for lawyers, and nobody really understands that. And now there's clear wording that it needs to be a language which can be understood by the individual using that it can be simplified by even standardized icons, so that we get more to technical standards, harmonizing the way how we communicate about the fact if personal data should be used, and if yes, for which purposes, and so on and so on. So that's what this regulation brings forward, besides that we harmonize our rules and that we better enforce it worldwide with the sanctions. And then there are some other new provisions, but I don't want to go too much into detail. That's just for your basic understanding to see where and how did we come to this result. Okay, so maybe I just say just some words also on the question of data transfers to third states, because that's always an issue which we have to talk about, and then I would like to perhaps directly hand over to you for questions. In data protection laws in Europe, it's the same now under the current directive and the national laws as with the GDPR. There's mainly 3, or you could say 4 ways of doing data transfers from the European Union to another state. The first is that a third country is seen as providing adequate data protection standards. And the European Commission has decided that this is the case, that there is adequate data protection standards. That happened with some of the states in the world, like Switzerland or Canada, because there the European Commission came to the conclusion that these countries deliver for an equivalent protection level as in comparison to the European Union. So data can more or less freely flow to those countries. The second way is that there's contractual standards or clauses, contractual standard clauses, and they are designed only for a certain product and only for a certain company, and they have to be agreed by the data protection authorities. So the CNIL in France, for example, they need to approve that, and then data can flow, but only for this company or only for that purpose of data processing. And then there's certainly the possibility of asking for consent, of course. You can always consent to everything. So if you say, okay, I'm fine that my data is being transferred to China and I have no rights there, then it's fine. I wouldn't do that, but it's possible. And then there are some smaller exceptions. That would be the fourth option. For example, if there's like a civil court case you are having and it's necessary to transfer the data, then there needs to be an exception. And of course, if there's an international agreement in place allowing for the data transfers, for example, mutual legal assistance treaties where the police sends data to other states, and that's done on international agreements. There's one issue which everybody is interested in, and that is a sectorial adequacy decision with the United States called the Privacy Shield. Throughout the last 15-16 years, it was called Safe Harbor, and that was a little bit creative idea how to grant adequacy to companies from the United States, because basically it was not possible to say that the United States deliver for adequate safeguards, because they are not delivering for that. Because there's not even a federal data protection law in the United States. So you only have privacy provisions for the public sector, but there's nothing on the federal level for companies. So they decided to say that companies from the United States can sign up for certain principles, and then they are regarded as being from an adequate country. So that not the United States is seen as to be adequately protecting personal data, but all these companies signing up to the principles which were worked out by the European Commission. And the European Court of Justice had said that the safe harbor principles were not protecting enough the European citizens, and therefore was, after 15 years, dismissing that decision. And now, under the name of Privacy Shield, the whole thing is back, and nobody really knows if it's sufficiently protecting either. But for the moment, that's the way of processing or transferring data to the United States. That's just to bring you into that debate. But as I said, I would like rather to answer to your questions and get into what you're interested in than talking more about my ideas. Yep. Absolutely. I will repeat this. So what hinders a company to just change the setting if somebody consented or not? And is there any necessity to get a proof of the consent or to document that? Basically, there is the necessity for every company to document every step regarding the processing of personal data, including the fact that they asked for the consent and got that consent. So they need to document the consent. And of course, like with many things in life, they could fake things, but if somebody really gets on their way, and an authority investigates and they see that they have faked it, obviously, and people are testifying that they never really consented, although it's marked there, then of course they will be sanctioned for that, So I can, of course, I don't know, if I want to save taxes, for example, people fake documents so they can save taxes. If they are captured by the tax authorities, they have to be sanctioned, and the same is with data protection in that case. There is, of course, the threat that companies act in an illegal way, but therefore we have this duty of documentation, and we have strong data protection authorities which should be equipped in a good manner and which should be independent. And they can do investigations as police can do investigations for certain issues, and then The big change now is that there are these strong sanctions lying in the air, and there everybody should really think if it makes sense to like act illegal or not, because I think that with these sanctions in the air, nobody really wants to be non-compliant anymore, which is a very good thing, because many companies really now, for the first time in history, take data protection seriously, while before they thought we don't need to really deal with that because nobody is sanctioning us if we or giving penalties if we act illegal. That will change now. The important issue is that everything needs to be documented. Oh, so many questions. Where do I start? Here. Yeah, it's a big question. So the question is, what happens if people do not consent? For example, if I'm asked on a website to consent, and the question if I just have to consent, or if there's an alternative offered, then if I to use the service without that personal data being involved, and so on. That until today was not really answered and addressed by the legislator, only in different interpretations of the existing law. But with the general data protection regulation, there's one very important step which we took, and that is to say that in order for consent of an individual to be free, and that is necessary, consent can only be valid if it's free. In order to it to be free, it has to be clear that I cannot consent if I have to fear economic disadvantages afterwards, if I say no to it, or other disadvantages. And that is why there is a clear provision that in those cases consent is not valid. So if somebody asks me, do you consent, otherwise you can't use the service, and I say yes, then the processing would be illegal because it's no free consent. I had to consent, so we forbid those services to do that. The solution to it can be two ways. Either I say, okay, then it's not necessary to say to consent, so I just ask you voluntarily, do you want to consent or not? And if I consent, fine. If not, fine. The second option is that the company either says the one who is not consenting has to pay money to use the service. That is a solution which may even still not be legal, because if that's really leading to the situation that I have to be able to afford my fundamental right, that shouldn't be compatible with that provision. So I'm not sure if that at all has any space to exist. Some people say it may exist if the value is really the same, like the data, but nobody knows how much the data is the value of the data is, and if it's really a free decision to say, okay, either I pay or I give my data. I don't really think that that exists. So the second possibility of that second way is that you ask everybody to pay money if you need that to be done, so and that is something which is of course up to everybody who offers services. One debate we just have is we have the reform of the e-privacy regulation, that is the field of communications data, and there it is about cookies, for example, on websites. That's your example. And at the moment we are debating that there should be an active ban on so-called cookie walls, so that some websites say, okay, if you don't agree that this cookie is being set, you can't access the website. And we say we actively ban that because, as I said, there's no way that you can give your consent freely in that situation, because you can only access if you give your data. So many companies have to think then about the question, okay, if we can not urge them to take the cookie, we can't do targeted advertisement, for example. So the solution at the end for them is maybe only to then have a paywall and to say, okay, everybody who wants to access has to pay. That's the development, more or less. I can clearly understand that, of course, many people think, yeah, but I would rather like to pay with my data. But the point is that that may lead to the situation that only those who can afford it will be able to afford services which are respecting your fundamental rights. Everybody else will have to give all the time personal data and have to take off all the clothes to enter into services, and that's something which is incompatible with our understanding of fundamental rights. I will go back here soon. Just yes. I don't think that companies will be able to afford that. Can I answer in English? Okay, yeah. I don't think that you can afford that, because 4% of your yearly worldwide turnout for a company is quite a lot. It's not like some thousands of euros, because if you calculate that, for example, for Facebook, they would really have to pay billions of euros as a sanction, and you can see in other examples, like with Volkswagen, who have been sanctioned by the US authorities, and afterwards it was unclear if they would survive that penalty. And that's one of the biggest companies also in the world. It's not really an option anymore. It was different until now, because until now it was in many member states, also in France, that you could also only sanction some 100,000 euros. And for a big company having a huge turnout, that was really nothing, so you could just pay that. But with the percentage of the yearly turnout, that's almost impossible to do that. But if that is not sufficient, also another thing, and that is the damage to your reputation. If there's really such a case, and the authorities give such a huge amount of money on your case, and you're just paying, I don't think you would survive the public outrage which would follow. Yeah, many of these decisions. So just to repeat, sorry, the question is if the data protection authorities in every member state of the European Union will be able to afford the same equipment and personnel which they need to assure that these laws are equally applied. And until now, there is no final answer from all the member states how they will equip their national data protection authority in the light of these new tasks, and they still have 6 months to do that. But in the end, there is a clear indication in the regulation directly to the member states that it needs to be sufficient. Of course, that's up to debate of the national parliaments, which in most of the member states are then now deciding on the equipment. But you can already see now that most of the member states invest far more money into the equipment of these authorities than before. If that is sufficient is another question, because the tasks and the challenges in this field are so big, I would say far bigger than members of parliaments until now have understood. So of course there are also far more cases brought forward, and there are far more tasks to really investigate in details and to get technically skilled staff, which they also have to afford first to pay, and to get into algorithms and code to understand what's happening actually with the data. So I'm not sure if they will be able to come up very quickly with a sufficient amount, but at least it's far more than before. So of course, when there are these sanctions, maybe there's some money coming back, so maybe they're able to also afford more oversight stuff afterwards. Good question. So, first of all, the question was if because the state also gathers quite a lot of data on us, for example, with ID cards and all this, like digitalization of administration, and the question is if they have to follow the same rules and if they will be sanctioned also in the same way. Yes and no. They will have to follow the same rules in general. For example, all the provisions on individual rights, all the provisions on the principles of data protection, privacy by design, and so on. They will have to follow all of those rules directly from the regulation, because the regulation is not only applicable to private companies, but also to public authorities. They can, the national parliaments can pass laws where they can restrict certain rights, for example, for law enforcement authorities in certain areas. The regulation is restricting that power to restrict. They say clearly you can only do it if you really can prove that it's necessary and if it's proportionate and so on, but they can do it. They can limit these rights. And the oversight by the authorities is there, but the sanctions can be decided differently in the member states. There you see that European laws are always also compromises. And especially when it comes to public authorities, the member states, they want to decide on their own how to deal with them. And some member states say, yeah, let's sanction the authorities. Some member states say, oh, we have never fined any authority because they made something wrong, so we won't do that. So it's very different, the approach, how they sanction the authorities. Yeah, that depends. The right to be forgotten also applies to public authorities, but I don't see that there is a public authority providing for a search engine, for example, at the moment. But if that would be the case, or if something like a public register is there, I think that in France there are some public registers, for example, for landowners or something, then there may be even the right to be forgotten applicable there. And at the end, it doesn't matter if they are sanctioned or not, because you can always go to court and enforce the law. So, I mean, that's the good thing. The data protection regulation, you can go to a French court and sue the commune because they didn't really respect these rights in the future. And that is something which is important as a step forward. But of course, at the end, especially when it comes to law enforcement and security, it's very much up to the decision of parliaments. Of national parliaments, and we just saw the Assemblée Nationale voting for very rigorous anti-terrorism laws, so that counts in France, so you can go to court against it, you can go even to the European Court of Justice, but it's up to courts to decide at the end if they can uphold those rules or not. It's mainly applicable in normal authorities and in the private sector, but I think that today it's very clear, different than in the past, that the question of how to regulate all of us and the private sector seems to be far more important. Not because the state is not powerful again anymore, but because the state can't afford to to process so much information than the private sector. That's also why the intelligence services and the police and so on, they only access data of private companies now. They don't go out and collect data anymore, they just access data of private companies. But that makes it even more important to deal with data in private companies, because it cannot only be hacked, but it can also be accessed by security authorities, and we can't really differentiate anymore between the state and private companies, because they are acting more and more together. It's even going so far that some private companies are urged to be like the assistant sheriff to do policing online on their own, even. Yeah. Do I have to repeat the question again? Yeah. Okay. So it's about the question how to address the question of consent and how people can understand better what they are consenting to, especially young people, children, or youth, and also if we have an approach in the European Union on the importance of understanding data protection is important for me, and so I have to care. I think there's two-side answer. One is in the regulation, as I explained, there is quite a lot of ideas how to make it more transparent, more easily understandable, how to make it easier to communicate about my preferences, because sometimes it's very complicated. Nobody really goes like 3 levels down to do a setting which I don't understand. And also to make sure that people are knowing about the consequences of data processing. So better information about what happens with your data and what is the idea behind. But there's a second side of this answer, and that is that we can do a data protection law which tries to bring you as much information as possible, make it easy, understandable, as I said, with symbols, standardized, and so on, to make it very easy. But if you don't care giving your away your data, you can always do it, because we do not forbid anyone to give personal data. That's very important. The fundamental right to data protection is only a fundamental right. It's not a fundamental duty or something like that, you know. If you don't care about your fundamental right, you can just, of course, not use it. And there, I think that we can not solve the problem only by legislation, only by law. It needs to be a society debate, and there needs to be far more education about the fact that I have to take care, that it is part of my human dignity, about my self-control in society, that maybe data processing can really have huge impacts on my economic situation, on my freedom to choice or to act and to live, you know. So that is by far not there, you know. So I think that we have to do much more there on education, and maybe the real big change in society will only come if there are real big damages already done. That's very often the case, as we know. And we already see that there are big damages with huge hacks and issues where people learn it on the hard tour, you know. But what we really try to do with legislation is making consent a more meaningful situation, to deliver for more easily understandable information and symbols. And I think that the way of standardization, of standardized symbols, is really the future, because it's like traffic signals. I can understand, okay, if I want to go to the right, or if I can, or what the consequence is if I don't respect certain rules, or, you know, so something like that. A basic understanding in society, so that we can move automatically by controlling ourselves. But that's a long way until there. And we need people who understand the technical side and it can explain to the people what that means, and also to lawyers and politicians what that means in society terms. Perhaps, yeah, somewhere behind. Okay, so the question is that more and more data is used to provide for more services and more offers for consumers, and if we reduce the possibility to like innovate and provide services with personal data, because we reduce the amount of personal data available, if that has negative consequences perhaps on consumers, and if that for me would be tolerable as a consequence for all of us. I think that I don't think we reduce the amount of personal data, we only change the way how you can use it. I don't say that there should be less personal data be used. I just say people should be more involved about the question if they want their data to be used. So if people at the end still say, I'm fine with it, then there is the same amount of personal data out there. But of course, this is mostly about protecting those who don't want their data to be processed, but whose data is being processed because they just don't care, or that they are just not involved, they are just not asked. And of course, if they would be asked, if they would be involved more, maybe they would be more restrictive with regard to their personal data. And so the consequence, of course, could be that there's less personal data be used for services and innovation. I'm convinced that there are two answers to that. One is if there is innovation on privacy-friendly products or on anonymization, maybe the same amount of innovation, the same amount of service could be done with less amount of personal data. And the other answer is that maybe if having a functioning fundamental right on data protection and privacy and having a society where people don't give so much personal data means that there is less services, then this is the price we say we pay to save our values. So these are the two answers. I very much believe that there's much more possible with personal with non-personal data, with anonymization, with privacy-friendly tools and innovation. But I also think that there may be a limit to that, and this limit is then maybe the price to preserve some kind of privacy and self-determination in a digitalized society. That's always so. The question, if it's possible to as a consumer only say you can have these kind of personal data and something else I don't want to give. So that really depends on the offer on the data controller side. You know, if that is offered to you, we don't ask clearly for data controllers to allow that I can give only this or that data. But there is one important differentiation, because we say that either data is necessary for a certain service, then it's fine to process the data in most of the time, and you agree to that in your terms of use, you know, or it's not necessary, and then it should be free to set my settings on my own and to say I give it or I give it not. And then there can be also clearly like specific indication. But that always depends also on the side of the offering service. If I'm asked, and do you want to give all your data for these purposes, yes or no, or if I say you can switch it on or off on your own, that's a question of your offer. If you want to offer that to your clients or not, and it's a question of the consumers to say, I want a service where I can set my preferences in a more detailed way. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that you should always deny that, because unless you have the consent of all your contacts, and that is mostly most of the case not the case. I really think that's a very bad thing that this is happening, and with WhatsApp there is a very bad example there. I don't think that this should be done, you know. But of course, many services work with this, and at the moment I would say it's in a gray zone. Maybe I would even say that it's not really legal, but that's still not up to a court to decide on that at the moment. There's no case. We have to come to an end, I guess. Yeah. 10 minutes. Okay, so then we. So where are the questions? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I would say perhaps we take these 4 questions, or perhaps 5, and then I think my time is run out. That's always a way to extend it. Okay, so the first question regarding the competitiveness of the European Union with these gold standards in place, while on the other side of the ocean they still don't really care about having standards, or perhaps even go in the other side, in the opposite direction. I would say that with our high standards at the moment, which we built up in the European Union, we really have a chance to create a global standard and to have a huge impact on the world of tomorrow. While in the US, obviously, there's no real try and also no real chance to do that, at least not from the regulator side. Of course, the companies there, they have a big impact and they set like the standards on the ground. But from their side, there's also very different actors. You have those who think, and who changed already to the situation that they say, for us, data protection and privacy and also IT security are a selling point, and we would like to improve on that. And they can easily adapt also to the European standards. And you have those companies who still drive this business model of harvesting personal data of their users in order to make more profits with advertisement or with new tools which they build on that, machine learning and so on. And I think that this business model, which I just mentioned, is not really sustainable, because it doesn't really build on the relationship to the individual on a way that the individual, if it understands what's really going on, wants to continue. You know, until now, the individual perhaps doesn't really understand what's happening. So there's no matter for them to really doubt that the business model is working. But the more people get up to speed with the technological development, and the more people see the consequences of, for example, giving away their personal data, they will go away from these services and go with those who are respecting more their standards and quality ideas, which they would like to follow up. And in this regard, I think that the European Union, by setting the standard first and by already being quite good on data protection, has a window of opportunity to really get a competitive advantage on the global market, to deliver from data protection friendly products, for alternatives, for innovation on anonymity, on big data with non-personal data, and so on and so on. I think that there is a real chance. The question is if we use that chance. That's up to the economical debate which we are having. But I very much hope that this is possible. And if you ask the smaller competitors to Silicon Valley who are situated here, they are all in favor of having this regulation and this standards advantage, because they see their only opportunity in being competitive in these standards and in high quality of products and services. Oh, sorry, I forgot the second question. The secure encryption standard. I don't know, but I mean, you should know that perhaps better than me, and perhaps I'm wrong, but I think that there is no secure standard out there. I mean, everything you program, but anyway, that was just one thing which I understood about coding. But of course, you can make it very secure. I agree, and I really think that it should be a standard. Yes, and we are currently working on that. There is a reform process. The one is the e-privacy regulation, where it is about communication, where we try to bring in that all communication should be encrypted, at least with a certain state-of-the-art technique. And the same is in a communication code, which is like the more technical regulation for telecommunication services and so on, where we say the same, that they need to encrypt on a certain level. And I very much hope that we will be able to do that. But of course, you know that there is a huge debate going on from the security side, from the security angle, where security policy people say, if you do that, then this will be blacking out security and police services from doing investigations and so on. I really disagree to that, because I think it's not about encrypting everything with the highest possible standard. It's about encrypting communication with the highest possible standard. And there, I think that the infrastructure of communicating, that should be really secure. And if somebody wants to get on my back by hacking into my phone and so on, okay, they can do that. I can protect myself. But of course, if the state is possible to pay good hackers to hack into my phone, okay, that's then perhaps possible, and maybe they can even get a proportional legal base for that, because I'm suspicious and so on. Then this is the way of how they should do it, but not attacking the infrastructure as such. So that's more or less the direction which we take, but it's a very hard debate, as you can imagine. So I'm not sure if we will be able to win that battle. No. So the question is if a company which is outside of the European Union, no. Outsourcing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that always is there. It's always important to distinguish between a processor, which is only processing the data on behalf of me. I say how they should process the personal data, or if it's another controller. So I give it to somebody, and they decide what they want to do with it. Because if it's the latter one, then this controller always has to process on under EU law themselves, and they need to get consent in or a legal base for processing in the same way like me. If it's only a processor, then it is fine that I give my data there, as long I respect the data transfer rules. You know, if there is an adequacy decision for that country, that's fine. Otherwise, I have to either have contractual clauses or binding corporate rules. But if that's not in place, then I may not do that. I may not give the data to a processor in India if there's no specific safeguard in place. Yes, of course, because you are subject to EU law, and even if that processor is violating EU law, they will also be subject to sanctions. And just to say that it's working, you know. So even if you hide somewhere in the world, there is legal assistance of these states, and they will enforce EU sanctions too. I mean, of course, that has its limits. You can hide somewhere, but bigger companies can't do that, you know. So, and most of the companies also have representatives here in Europe, and they will be jailed if they don't pay the fine, you know. So nobody wants to do that. Yes. Yeah, the new rules have to be implemented until the 25th of May next year. That's the last day, and you need to comply from that day. And there's no possibility to change that. It's done. But of course, if there is a smaller company, for example, or a smaller association, which hasn't fully got along speed with the regulation, it's up to the authorities, up to the CNIL, for example, to say, okay, you're small companies, you don't have a clue. Please fix the thing in 6 months, and it's fine, you know. But if it's Google not having implemented the rules on the 26th of May, they will get a fine, you know. So that's clear. Okay, two questions, but I'm sorry. We will have to perhaps answer the other questions then afterwards by email. But I will take you and you behind, so you two. Okay, 2 more minutes. So quick. On do companies? Okay, yeah. Okay, do companies have specific instructions how to deal with the right to be forgotten? That's a big question. I mean, it's not so many companies who are subject to that, because it's mainly about delisting in search engines or public registers. And most of the companies which I know that this applies really to, they have their own rules how to deal with that. The question is how to decide about these rules, because it's very different very often. And the data protection authorities, they more and more give guidelines to those companies. They decide you should do this or you should do that, and then they have to implement these rules. Maybe mainly there's the possibility to contact that company. Here there's this information, I would like that to be delisted, and then the company has some internal rules how to deal with that request, and then to decide that. And they have to do it very closely coordinated with the data protection authorities. Okay, last question. Hmm. Yeah. So the question is, if in light of the terrorist attacks and the security situation, especially in Europe, here in France, a country of the European Union could just say, because of these security threats, we need to ignore the EU legislation and do mass surveillance, for example, and so on. Basically, the data protection regulation and the fundamental right to data protection in the European Union, they clearly apply to everything what the member states do. with one exception, and that is national security. So intelligence services, for example, in Europe, they still can do whatever they want. But of course, in this area, you could still argument it's against our European values, like Hungary writing things into their constitution which violate European values, for example, media freedom and so on. You can debate that, and there are procedures to also sanction member states with that. But in all other areas, including also law enforcement, they need to be in line with the principles which we set out on a European level. They cannot just go beyond that. And everybody can go to the European Court of Justice if they think that the member state violates these. And the European Court of Justice is higher. And at the moment, no member state has tried to just ignore EU court judgments. There is Hungary, Orban, who has announced that on refugees they don't want to do that, but I don't think they will be able to afford that because it's a complete no-go. So of course, in theory, you could, as you could like leave the United Nations or whatever, but it's not really something which is realistic. They will oblige to and abide to what the European Court of Justice says. And one thing, the European Court of Justice, for example, in December just judged on a law in the UK and in Sweden on data retention of telecommunications data, and said blanket retention of telecommunications data is not in line with EU law. So don't do it. So now the debate goes on how to do security measures, including data retention, which is more focused, for example, which doesn't just collect data of all of us, but only for those who are suspicious. It's a huge debate. It will take some years for this to get forward. But you see that there is a debate on this. But in this area of security, of course, the debate is like more flexible and takes the time to change. And of course, now in France you have quite extensive surveillance laws. Maybe there will be court cases afterwards which say that was completely overdriven, and then things will change again a little bit. But in this field of security, it's not so easy to say this is legal, this is illegal, because it's more it's the exceptional case, the state of emergency, and you judge in the blue of proportionality. Is it proportionate to survey everyone to save some lives or not? So that's the debate. It depends very much on the public opinion and on court cases which always come after and later. But there you can see that it's an ongoing debate, and it will go on always on this question. And I'm very happy that you are taking this debate, at least with me. And I hope that you will be able to follow up what we're doing in this area and to get politically involved, because I think there needs to be more people who know about all of this in politics. So if at a certain moment you decide to perhaps also become a politician, you're always invited to do that, or to change between two different worlds, which is like technical sides or legal issues or political issues. I encourage you to do that because it's also very exciting to see how this interacts: society, technical things, political decisions, legal frameworks. It's very important that you get involved in this, and that you also try to explain to people how things go so that they can take their decisions. Thank you for inviting me, and have a good day.